Tuesday. When morning arrived, we went into Miranda de Corvo to inform the shop from where we had ordered the white goods that we were now ready to receive them. When the fridge and freezer and oven arrived, all was going well until our attention was drawn to the fact that in our not exactly finished home, there was no electrical supply running below the work surface where the oven was to be placed. Luckily, the hob we had bought was gas, and this was installed and ready to use with the help of a match. The oven would be installed when a power source was within its reach. The matter of electricity had already arisen previously that day, when there had been a rattle at our gates, and through the large window at the side of the house, from the area which was awaiting a dining table and chairs, we saw three men wearing the uniforms of EDP, Portugal's electricity company. We had known that our solicitor was arranging for our supply to be connected and registering it in our name, but we were surprised and impressed that this was happening so soon. Then, to our embarrassment, a little while later we discovered that the power had never actually been disconnected, and that in the mess of wires and switches that was our power supply, we had simply failed to find the combination which made it live. The real reason EDP had arrived that morning was not to save us spending more money on candles, but because they had been asked to upgrade the power so that more than the kettle and the light could be used at the same time. While two of the men looked at the fuse box in the kitchen, the third one went upstairs with us to the room where our electricity meter sat on the floor in an old wooden box. The EDP employee shook his head and smiled upon viewing the scene, and we felt we had been forgiven the idiocy of sitting in darkness the previous night, because amongst the general spaghetti of wires were two old fuses ingeniously adapted for their purpose. The circuit breakers were similar to the ones I remember my parents taking out and threading wire through on occasions when I was a child. But instead of single lengths of wire with different thicknesses to withstand the relevant electrical current, threaded through each of them was the same wire, the resistance made to vary by different multiples of the strands. As we had a space in an outside wall ready to receive the new meter, we asked about getting our one moved to it. We were informed by one of the men from EDP, who spoke English, that the company was responsible for the power supply up to it entering the house, and the responsibility of wiring from then was that of the owners. Nonetheless, we were given the phone number of an electrician friend who would probably be able to bring our wiring up to the standard required. And once this was done, we should contact the company again. We thanked the three men and put the piece of paper with the phone number of the electrician on the work surface. Then we did that most British of things. We put the kettle on and enjoyed our first cup of tea at home for 2 months. The mugs we drank from were ones we had salvaged and scrubbed clean after finding them amongst old wood, ceramic tiles, cement buckets, screws, nails, cardboard, dust, and various types of mould during the previous week. But their heritage was not reflected in the taste of our long-awaited first cuppa. Feeling refreshed, Stephen next went to the Camera Town Hall in Miranda de Corvo with our solicitor to arrange our water supply to be connected. But this procedure proved more involved in getting our electricity to the sockets and switches. We had water running to pipes which were located in an outside box, similar to the one provided for the electricity meter, but unfortunately also bore similarities in the fact that no meter was present to connect the supply to the pipework entering the house. We did, of course, have the industrial-looking hose, which the renovators of the property had used, protruding through the wall from the property next door. But we felt uncomfortable about the link between the two buildings and asked for its removal as soon as possible. Luckily, though, our village was here before the convenience of indoor plumbing, and as a result, there are many fonts which the government maintains, and we had one of these a minute or two's walk away. meeting people. Our furniture was not scheduled to arrive for another 6 days, and during the previous week we had made ready what we could, such as washing the floors and general cleaning. So little short of waiting remained to be done for the main house. But the two other buildings which were part of our property ate into this time. The smaller of the two projects stood the other side of the gate and nestled on two of its rectangular sides against a neighbouring house. It had been cleared of many of the miscellaneous objects which had lain around at the time we were in Portugal to sign the promissory agreement, but the larger building, annexed to our house but partially sitting beneath the house the other side to us, was where we had found the tea mugs, and this still had a lot of old building materials remaining in it. Many details about the general clearing up are lost to me now, but with refuse collections being made from large communal bins rather than from individual households, disposing of unwanted items was no great problem. We inherited a couple of old rugs with the purchase of the house, for which we had been very grateful, as they provided a reprieve from the hard surfaces that offered no comfort or warmth to feet or bums. But when our furniture arrived, we decided to keep only one of the floor coverings, because you never know, we might want it some day, I informed Stephen. When I'd lived in Athens, there was a similar arrangement as here for refuse collection, and people often left items that were not wanted by the side of the bins for others to collect if they needed or wanted. So Stephen and I decided to try the same thing here in Portugal. We took the rug down to the bins at the bottom of our road, and as we did so, we saw a neighbour and asked him if it was okay to leave it there. He confirmed that it was, and within a couple of hours, the item had gone. Our successful disposal of the mat led us to do the same with some old clothes at a later date. But an item in our clearing up that had created a problem disproportionate to its size was an old oil drum. The rusting metal barrel had stood in a corner of the garden, where it had filled with rainwater spilling off the terracotta roof tiles of the annexed building, covering old plaster which had remained in it. Adding to the barrel's contents were brambles which trailed in and over the cocktail, no doubt having made their thirsty way from the field the other side of the wall when the summer sun had borne down on them. I cut back the vegetation, and Stephen helped me tip the contents of the oil drum onto the weed-covered earth, which I hoped would not like the substance. Then, with hacksaw, pliers, hammer, tooth and nail, not to mention scathing words, I attacked the object, and it was eventually in the back of Betsy and on its way to a bin further afield. We thought it right not to use only our local bins. Our nearest neighbours were a Portuguese couple in their 80s, and they lived in the first house as you turned into our little road. On our second visit to view our home, we had seen the man sitting on the veranda above his yard, and Stephen had commented that he looked as though he might have a rifle at the side of his chair. This, accompanied by the man's proud stance, caused us to nickname him the Major. Our plumbing situation meant that we were buying bottled water from the supermarkets to drink and using water from the font to flush the toilet. And on our third day in our village, while Stephen was filling one of the empty mineral water bottles by the font for this purpose, he met the Major. With the limited Portuguese we had learnt whilst still in England, it had been understood that the water coming from the tap was very good to drink, but that the water which ran most of the year from a hose alongside this font tap drained from the fields above and should not be drunk. With this information, we stopped buying the bottled stuff, and a routine which lasted into a second week began. Although neither of us had work to rush off to, and we were not tied to any other timetable, we rose at around 7:30 to the sound of the alarm of my mobile phone. Next, we got dressed without washing and left the house, following the road a couple of metres to the right on its climb upwards. After looping to the left, almost directly above us, At a house which was owned by a British couple who visited once a year was the source from which we used to stock up our 40 litres of water every morning. Before the wood burner arrived, the kettle was our only provider of hot water, and we had stripped washes in the bathroom of a night with the aid of flannels we had brought at the market and a wash basin of warm water. In the morning, we satisfied ourselves with washing our faces and hands and damping down our hair. Wednesday. 7 days previously, we had been to the market in Miranda de Cordoba, and now we returned to purchase a couple of pots we had seen there. I'm sure there are many English people who pass through Portugal with the promise to buy something the next week, and who never do return a próxima semana. So I think the woman on the stall was surprised to see us. One of the things that Stephen and I have in common is that we're both friendly people. But whereas I tend to keep a British reserve about me, Stephen is controlled more by his emotions. And when we saw the lady at the market and her smile welcomed us, he did not hesitate to go to her and give her a respectful kiss on either cheek. We left the market with 2 terracotta casserole dishes that cost little, and a new acquaintance that we would exchange pleasantries with and try to support throughout the following months. Another purchase at the market that day was a round red plastic bowl about 3/4 of a metre in diameter. We had left England 10 days before with a limited amount of clothes, and by now we were down to only a couple of clean items. Luckily though, the weather provided sunny days as December established itself and the heavy rains of November were left behind. And when we returned home from town, Stephen set about doing a bit of hand washing, sitting on the step of the annex, soon to be named the Lemon Room. With an air of satisfaction, the washing was hung on a piece of clothesline strung between the apple and the mandarin trees that stood opposite each other in the garden at that time. Once buying our newspapers had become a routine, we introduced ourselves to the kiosk owner and learned that her name was Isabel. We estimated this woman to be around the same age as we were, mid-40s, and she worked in the kiosk 7 days a week, although Sunday was a half day. Isabel and her kiosk had been on the corner for over 20 years, moving slightly in that time when a new road layout was introduced to the junction. From the few square metres of space which a little 2-bar electric fire could not heat sufficiently in winter and which became a furnace under the summer sun, she sold newspapers and magazines. A photocopying service was also provided, but for us it was Isabel's local knowledge and friendship we found invaluable. Our village was not unusual in having no mains gas pipes to it, and so the butano or propano for our oven and water heater needed to come in bottles, and it was at Isabel's kiosk that we also bought these. Unfortunately, we caused confusion there where there should have been none, thanks to the €10 deposit that needed to be paid for the bottle. Stephen and I understood this one-off payment, and because we wanted to purchase 2 bottles, one as a reserve, we also fully understood that 2 deposits would be needed. Our way of thinking was strange to Isabel, and she interpreted our need for a second bottle as being a short-term one, and was therefore reluctant to take the €20 from us, meaning that we left with 2 bottles, having paid only 1 deposit. During the following couple of months, every time we returned a gas bottle and bought another, the deposit system was explained, but our payment of the second deposit repeatedly refused. Stephen and I tried to tell Isabel that we understood that we needed to pay another €10 and that we were happy to do this, but we needed a better translator than goodwill alone in this situation. Eventually, during one of our conversations at the kiosk, its owner called a friend who spoke English and Portuguese, and a woman in an apron joined us within a few minutes, having left the florist's where she worked. The misunderstanding was cleared up, and when we all understood each other, Stephen and I paid the second deposit and purchased a gas bottle without further confusion. Thursday. Just after 9:30, there was a rattle at our gates, and a slight figure with grey hair stood on the other side of them, holding in each hand a dark green cabbage that was a giant by any standard, but which dwarfed the slight figure of Maria, who was the Major's wife. The vegetables were proffered to us and accompanied by words Stephen and I could not understand. So, trying to steer ourselves onto familiar ground, we introduced ourselves and hoped that an introduction would be reciprocated. Perhaps it was our lack of sufficient Portuguese or our poor pronunciation which stopped the conversation before it could begin. But communication is made with more than words, and the smiles we exhibited must have been sufficient thanks, even if our oral obrigado had not been understood either. A signal for change. Despite the complications of language, the overtures to a new friendship made by Maria were marked in my mind because of the contrast they made with the initial introduction to Stephen's neighbours in London, when greetings had been polite but lacked warmth. During the 20 years Stephen had occupied the top flat in the conversion, several people had come and gone from the floor below, and being an amiable person, he had got on with them all, to varying degrees. However, the dynamics in the house changed when I was invited to move in, and due to the house having been divided with only limited competency, noise seeped through the spaces between floorboards, and conversations climbed in and out of open windows. Adding to the changed dynamics was a shared front door which opened and closed at different times to which had been accepted, and Stephen discovered that hands which had once extended outwards in friendship were withdrawn. The wood burner. Shortly after the cabbages had arrived, the salamander followed. Stephen and I assisted in bringing it into the house, but even with 4 of us manoeuvring it, the weight was considerable. The obvious place for it was slightly to the left of the hole in the ceiling under the stairs. In this position, it sat neatly and caused no obstruction when entering from the dining area into the room we would later call the winter room. Lengths of stainless steel tubes and joints formed a 45-degree angle that made the connection between the fire and the chimney above. And within only 15 minutes, we had means to heat the house and had been given instructions not to use paper when lighting the fire, but rather the paraffin firelighter blocks which supermarkets sold for around €2.50 a box. The wood burner transformed our lives. Stone, ceramic tiles, cold concrete and ghosts relinquished their chill slowly, but heat radiated into the immediate vicinity of its iron body almost immediately. Later that day, Stephen and I moved our makeshift bed downstairs, which meant we also had somewhere warm and comfortable to sit during the day. The hot casing of the heater cooled to the recently bought casserole dishes. These rallied some cubes of beef, potatoes, and the cabbages our neighbour had brought us. I was petitioned to make a stew, and this sat on the top of the fire's casing, where it simmered for 7 or 8 hours. On the same day we had purchased the wood burner, we bought a water heater as well. The original plan was to have hot water arrive at the house the same day as the fire was installed, but we had yet to receive the water supply. So as well as cooking stew, the same hot surface provided us with another means of heating water in a large pan. From that point, we began bathing in 5 centimetres of water instead of having to strip wash at the basin. So for the first time since moving in, we fell asleep in a warm room, clean and with full bellies. The scarf that Stephen had wrapped around his head and around his neck on previous nights, making him resemble a Bedouin, was left folded on the floor. The iron stove meant that we needed firewood, and though we were aware this could be bought, we did not know how much it cost, who sold it, or how much we would need. But luckily, we had a couple of weeks to figure things out while we burned wood we had around the place after tidying up our home and clearing out the outside buildings. much of which came from the ceiling of the small detached building just inside the gate, where planks of tongue and groove cladding had hung down outside the bathroom. In hindsight, the work that needed to be done when setting up home in a new country and in a house that was not quite ready to inhabit should have been obvious. But if I was reading this account before Stephen and I had begun our process, I do not know if I would have started it. A comment from a friend who was replying to a card I had posted leading up to Christmas hints at how difficult things were. I hope you're less stressed than you sounded when you wrote. However, during the weeks we made our house into a home, the speed of events left little time for reflection, which came from many months later, and excitement and adrenaline sustained us in the manner it had during the previous months. Friday. When Stephen received a phone call in the morning asking him if he could receive our furniture that afternoon instead of the following Monday, as arranged, thoughts of consolidating and appreciating what we had already achieved were given the opportunity to surface, and we began counting the hours until we had a sofa to sit on and a proper bed to sleep in, along with clothes, cutlery, crockery, and accumulated objects that are the material sum of our lives. The removal lorry had reached Villanova when we received another phone call from the company, asking for directions to our house. Over time, we grew accustomed to directing people from our nearest town to our small village, but on that occasion we were still unsure of the lay of the land, and we drove the couple of minutes up the one winding road to meet the driver, and he followed us back. We stopped at the entrance of the narrow lane which leads to our house, and we advised the removal driver on the best way to enter it. Walking backwards while the van reversed along the narrow strip of tarmac, we passed the Major and Maria's house, and the van was forced to stop here because of the vehicle's height being greater than the space below the vines which crawled over the road from our neighbour's house to the wall the other side of the road. There were 50 metres or so remaining to our gates, and with little choice we assisted the two removal men in pushing and carrying our things up the slight incline. Our trips past the flight of concrete steps which led to the small building where the Major made his wine, the large concrete water tank, old well, and the holiday home of another English couple grew longer as the light faded and tiredness took hold. We had labelled the boxes with the room where the contents belonged, and initially these were dutifully placed accordingly, while the furniture was directed to its relevant area. But by the time the sudden blackness of night took over from evening's steady approach, boxes were being placed anywhere that was dry and out of the way. Our furniture found its new home, and we began the process of unpacking. Even with familiar items around us once more in rural Portugal, shadowed by the mountains of our village, we discovered that a world existed beyond central heating and fitted carpets. It was one of cold ceramic tiles and hot spots. The cats noticed the change too. Biscuit curled up into a tight ball on the back of the sofa to sleep instead of sprawling out on the floor, although this surface was not out of the question for Muffin if the wood burner was lit and the metre-wide area between it and the television cabinet had begun to warm. Christmas time. At first it was not easy to manoeuvre our car around the narrow road, bend and incline outside our house. So in December 2010, when we were novices at the specific three-point turn this requires, poor Betsy paid for our lack of experience. As Stephen moved the car forwards and backwards, trying to find the right angle to drive through our gates, we heard a scraping sound. But it was not until the next day, as the car was reversed, that we saw a puddle on the floor beneath where she had been parked. We monitored the situation over the following couple of days, and just 10 days before Christmas we took her to a Renault garage we had often driven past. Our visit to the garage was an introduction to labour costs much lower than those we had been used to in the UK. And over the year, we built quite a history with the Renault mechanic, who, due to his greasy hands when we first met him, greeted us by knocking the back of his wrist against ours. At the time, we were somewhat confused by this unconventional handshake, but before long saw the sense of this courtesy. Later occasions afforded Stephen and I the luxury of looking knowingly at each other when strangers found themselves needing to complete the turn near our house. A revved engine and the smell of burning rubber, a reminder of the ruptured water pump we had inflicted on our vehicle. The following day balanced out the misfortune we had with the car because our telephone line, and hence the internet, was installed. Part of our plans for financing a life here in Portugal was for Stephen to use technology and bring his students, who over many years of teaching had become friends, with us. The idea was for them to sit at home in England and musical instruction and guidance from their teacher to reach them via their computers. The method had been piloted using Skype while we were staying in Clacton before completing our move to Portugal, and the results had been encouraging. Yet, without an organ or piano, Stephen was unable to do much of what he needed to do, such as arranging pieces of music. And when November had begun and brought no final moving date, the lead up to Christmas seemed to be a good point at which students should take a break. Being back online meant Stephen began to make contact with people again. Emails were sent, and in Portugal and in England, webcams were positioned and experimented with. Internet connections tested, procedures for receiving data were taught and rehearsed, and dates scheduled for lessons to begin once more, with a contemporary breath of fresh air. Puzzle pieces fell into place one after the other, and the end of December approached without us realising it. Christmas that year was something we tried to appreciate because it was going to be our first one in a home that was ours. And one of the first things to come out of boxes were the Christmas baubles, lights, and boxes of cards which we sat writing out in our garden, wearing T-shirts while the inside of the house still struggled to hold warmth, and the friends we were writing to were emerging from the grip of the worst snowfall for years. Water had finally reached taps, and only slight tweaking of the water heater had been needed to make it deliver on its promise. Electricity for the oven had been run below the work surface, and the industrial-looking hose from next door no longer threatened to trip us up as we went up and down stairs. But we had not received the phone call from the shop in Coimbra where we had ordered our table and chairs. When Stephen and I had first viewed the house, one of the strongest impressions on us was the space we planned to eat in. We saw a dining table in the middle of the room with 4 chairs around it. The 2 unfinished light fittings hanging from the ceiling would, with the right shades and bulbs, hang low and create a warm, convivial ambience before the sun had risen and when it had retired for the day. And there would be an open invitation to sit down for something as simple as a bowl of cereal or as lavish as a Christmas dinner. In the London flat, Stephen had built a table which made use of a limited space by folding up against the wall, and this made it easy to transform the music room into a dining area. But this rarely happened because the times we worked provided little opportunity to eat our meals together, and generally they were eaten on trays. Noticing the time since we had ordered our furniture in Coimbra was nearer to 3 weeks than the 2 which had been suggested to us, and with only 3 days until we planned to lay the table for Christmas dinner, Stephen bravely telephoned the shop, and the call was answered by a man who spoke no English. Our limited understanding of Portuguese must have been detected by the person on the phone, because within seconds the man who had served us in the shop had taken over our inquiry. Immediately after Stephen posed the question, "Have our table and chairs arrived yet?" I saw his face relax as he was told that they had arrived in the store 2 days previously. But the tension returned as he was also informed that they had arrived the day after customer deliveries for our area were sent out, and that the next deliveries would not leave until after Christmas. Could we collect the furniture ourselves? Yes. Would it fit into a Renault Clio? I don't know, but you can try it. The next day, Stephen left around 8:30 in the morning to drive the half hour to Queenborough. And when he returned, he and Betsy had performed wonders. The 6-foot tabletop and its legs were designed to be assembled at home, so their transportation was not too difficult. However, the 4 chairs came assembled, and it must have been with sheer willpower that Stephen fitted these into our car. The 25th arrived, and we had no presents to unwrap, but when we arose, we went downstairs to light the fire. We turned on the fairy lights that illuminated the red berries and dark green foliage of some branches we had bought at the market the previous Wednesday from the lady at the flower stall who had helped with the translating when we had brought the terracotta dishes. By texts, we arranged times to Skype with our family back in England, and after we had showered and dressed, we went out for a walk. Christmas morning was cold, but here the day seldom seemed to be accompanied by the dampness that was synonymous with both the cold and the heat in London. And wrapped up with scarves and gloves, the chill did not permeate body and soul, but remained on the surface, like it did on leaves where it formed doilies of ice. We emerged from the trees and returned home on the road. We took photos of each other by a road sign that told the traveller that we were entering our village, and we felt proud of ourselves that we had made it, and it seemed strange to remember that even after such a little time we felt at home. Dinner was cooked between the two of us, and we sat down at our dining table in our dining area. We pulled Christmas crackers we had brought with us and wore the paper crowns long after the hen, which we had mistakenly brought instead of turkey, was consumed. There were no pigs in blankets, no minced tarts, no Christmas pudding, but the Queen's speech was listened to using the BBC iPlayer. And as the last week of the year galloped away, we watched some of our favourite Christmas films on DVD. A new year blows in. Portugal's new custodians are the sentinels which seek to protect their people using cold steel, not as a wielded weapon in the way the lords of flesh and blood did from castles that were built in similar landscapes, but with mechanical bodies that reach into the heavens. It was the last day of what had been an eventful year when Steve and I set off in the car to visit the Serra da Estrela, the mountain range which is Portugal's highest, climbs above towns where ski slopes, hotels and chalets accommodate those looking for some winter fun. As we drove past our neighbour's house, Maria was in her yard. She nodded to us, and we told her where we were going. "Faz muito frio," she said, and we echoed her, but tugged at our scarves and coats as a defence against the very cold weather. We were lucky enough not to have found our way to that mountain range on that day, because when we did make the journey a couple of months later in more clement weather and drove on steep roads with sheer drops below them, we realised how naive we must have appeared. The mountain we did explore part of that day was another one, part of the Serra de Lousã, and we found ourselves in a magical world. Stephen and I stopped the car and got out. We were surrounded by desolate rock, begrudgingly yielding gorse, copses of pine and loud whispers. Anything and everything seemed possible in this place. Man was dwarfed by his own creation, and nature's power could not be denied. Monsters and dreams could manifest here, and genius or madness could befall a living thing. An arm swept down from its cloak of mist. Within a couple of seconds it was lifted from us and not seen again, as a bank of thicker mist below drove across it, and our location was obscured as the wind turbine completed its turn. The previous New Year's Eve had been a disaster for us both, as the tension at the flat had begun to mount, and the relationship between Stephen and I was at that stage where foolish expectations lead to disappointments that are exaggerated beyond reason. If we are open to learning from them, though, time and events teach us, and after an eventful year, There we were, putting chairs out on our veranda in Portugal. At 11 o'clock, we wrapped up warm and took a couple of glasses and a bottle of port outside. The blankets we had around us were the ones that Mum and Dad had given us as our moving come Christmas presents when we had left England, and a hot water bottle was under these. The chimes of the church bell marked the passing of each 15 minutes, and the sound of voices bounced around the mountains, coming from the towns and villages nestled high and low within them. When 12 chimes signalled midnight, there were fireworks, and we raised our glasses to people who were living and people who had passed on. But foremost, we congratulated ourselves for what we had achieved, and thanked the gods, destiny, or luck for the life we were living and the promise it brought.